believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. My non-university unstudents, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. Happy Veterans Day! My thanks to all of you 19 million living military veterans who served our country. We wouldn't be free without you. Thanks. Wow, amazing, stunning, surprising. What a rowdy clown rodeo we watched, and I guess we still are, sadly, watching. Over 150 million people voted for president. That's a record in American history. And today I want to think aloud with you about the historical nature of the election. So today's show is going to go like this. First, I'm going to give some personal reflections. Then I'm going to give some reflections regarding the country. Third, more on history per se. I want to think a little bit of philosophy with you. And then fourth, I'll finish today with some theological reflections about God and history. Now, I got to warn you up front, I'm going to say some hard things. And it's not because I want to be divisive, but I'm going to do it because too much of the church is mute. Too much of the church has become afraid to say anything in tense times. So thanks for joining me. Maybe you want to grab a hot cup of joe, sit back, and let's think together. Personally, the election outcome is a kick in my stomach. This has been one of the longest weeks in my lifetime. I mean, like half the country, I'm rather shell-shocked. Election night, I went to bed with 6 swing states in the pink and woke up Wednesday morning with 4 of those 6 having turned light blue. Now remember, all the pollsters, they told us Vice President Biden would win in a landslide. Heck no, they said the Democratic Party would win in a landslide, taking not only the presidency, but the House and the Senate too. Turns out they were resoundingly wrong. And that means they were push pollsters. They were intending to pre-shape an outcome. Clearly, they have no intention to conduct polls with integrity. Now, I've only heard of one pollster apologizing for being so in error. Me? Because of the historic economic growth of the last 3 years and the wildly popular Trump rallies and the ambivalently attended Biden rallies and the tremendously accurate predictive model of Professor Norpoth, I was anticipating a red wave. No, actually, I had more reasons than that. I also wrongly assumed that folks were tired of the COVID narrative, and that they'd vote in light of how that narrative cost them their businesses, their futures, their salaries, a year so far of their kids' authentic education. Now they're doing it at home, and more we're learning that online education just really isn't education. I figured they'd vote in light of COVID and their not being able to attend their dying loved ones, watching friends and family get addicted to pharmaceutical drugs, seeing suicides go up in record numbers, and then churches closed and reopened, but told not to sing songs. Are you kidding me? Wow. Apparently the world spirit hates it when God's own sing to him. And then B, after COVID, I figured that people were fatigued by the burning of city commerce zones, and I assumed wrongly that they'd vote against how that violence cost them and so many others, how it cost them so dearly. How do you vote for the party that cheered on the burning of minority-owned businesses across the summer? How do you say, actually, I would like a second helping of that? Yes, please. No, I don't need a new plate. Just put it next to those cold taters there on the right, please. But as I confessed again last episode, I was wrong. And look, I can handle being wrong. What's tough to handle is the realization that the twisted, hyper-exaggerated, "you're all going to die, so you need to let us control your lives" COVID narrative has won. Irrational fear has won, right? The further we go, the more we learn that masks, as a preventative measure, show mixed results. And the COVID data reporting, again, more and more we're learning it was a joke. They were reporting people who had COVID as having died of COVID. That's not the same thing. But, human nature, we're so arrogant, we think we can control a viral pandemic. But my point is, I'm afraid that irrational fear has won. Burning and looting has won. Anger has won. And for me, that's all far more painful to process than that non-compos mentis Joe Biden is going to be president in a couple of months. Well, president at least for a few months before he gets the late-night Jeffrey Epstein visitation treatment. Lord, seriously, protect Joe Biden and his family. Give him godly wisdom and clarity. Or before Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer enact the 25th Amendment and tell us that Joe Biden is no longer fit to be president? Wow. No. 50.5% of our population is for this. Wow. That's tough. You'd like to have more faith in human nature. Whoo! And again, to echo a heart cry of mine, I'm so sorry to know that because of an American election, millions of babies around the world will be more easily and readily aborted. The American government funds, or not, all manner of foreign enterprises, things that accord with a specific American president's foreign agenda. And foreign abortions will once again, on Biden's first day, go on the huge uptick, all funded by American taxpayer dollars. And I find that, well, it's unthinkable that millions of self-confessing Christians can support an agenda where babies ultimately do not matter. It makes me heartsick. Perhaps, like the meme I just saw, those willing to kill the unborn should not be allowed to govern the living? But still, all of that, and am I finally crushed? No. I have a godly wife, godly children, godly family around me, a holy God-revering church to attend. I'm secure who I am in Christ. And my faith is in the living Christ, not in political configurations. Am I stunned? Yes. But give me a couple weeks and I'll be back to my happy, silly, gratitude-filled old self. For now, like half the nation, I'm processing. And I think it's okay to grieve. Take the necessary time to grieve and then get back to the crucial issues of your life. Seriously. So there's some personal reflections. What about the country? Well, again, the election was not a blue wave. Not only did the Democrats lose seats in the House, they did not, at least yet, take the Senate. That means Joe Biden will not be able to pack the Supreme Court. And the realization of that alone has the deep blue heads and hearts exploding in rage. I've read that AOC wants a list of Trump administrators and supporters that she can throw into prison. You've probably read that some Democratic congressfolk are saying, please, as a party, we can no longer say aloud the phrases socialism or defund the police, because those phrases are killing us. Those phrases cost us seats in the House and prevented us from capturing the Senate outright. So again, this was not a blue wave. Joe Biden, if he's either honest or wise, will avoid pretending he now has a mandate to hard leftify the country. And then, of course, what about the months on end of tantrum throwing? What about the tearing down of statues that told tales both of good and evil, of what our country has overcome? Statues that honored men of courage. Or what about the months on end of rioting, businesses suffering arson, the police being called pigs and shot? What has now happened with all of that? It's all been honored. It has all received a stamp of approval. Holy smokes. Do you know what happens when you let a toddler pitch a fit at the grocery store checkout stand, a screaming tantrum in front of other customers? Have you ever seen that? And then the parent rewards that toddler with the purple sparkly toy pony she was screaming that she should be given. What's the answer to that? You create a monster. Months of screaming, shaming, terrorizing, police shooting, city hall vandalizing with spray paint, it has all been given a certified stamp of approval. Blue ribbon! The monster has been placated. This is, I promise you, this is dangerous for the soul of our nation. Our democracy is under threat. It's truly just hard to imagine. From now on, when people... No, actually, it's the left. There were no summer mass riots conducted by citizens on the right. There were no riots from the right since the election. So when the left, for what, generations to come, don't get what they want, guess what's coming? Rioting, looting, arson, police shootings, threats to dox politicians they do not like, nasty loud protests in front of politicians' houses, threats of intimidation. Oh Lord, it's so ugly. And it has just been certified A+, gold medal. Wow. Stay tuned for side B on all that, because we have just unleashed a dragon.
But, Ed, now that Trump is gone, they'll go home and be quiet.
If you think that this election put the dragon to sleep, you are kidding yourself. Also, with respect to the country, we simply have to stabilize future voting procedures. There are too many reports, some with signed affidavits, of voting irregularities and manipulations. It ought to be simply no longer legal to turn in or count votes received after Election Day. I mean, it's very hard not to believe that Pennsylvania and Nevada and Georgia changed their election rules so that this precise, manipulative, post-election day, suspicious mail-in vote method can in fact be possible. In fact, you're not going to believe this, but I just received my Nevada election ballot in the mail 2 days ago. And when I called the Nevada State Elections Office to inquire about it, they said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Complete your ballot and mail it in. We'll accept it until November 21st.
Really?
No, but it's just about that sloppy. It ought be simply no longer legal to turn in or count votes received after Election Day. I mean, the IRS sure as hell does not accept penalty-free tax payments on April 16th or later. My credit card company extends me zero grace after the 5th of the month. Election Day should be called, what was it? Oh yeah, Election Day. For the sake of integrity, which is worthwhile in its own right, for the sake of integrity and national unity, the voting procedures need to be put right. Oh, and on that point, it's interesting to me. Conservative pundits were concerned pre-election that the Democrats variously would, if Joe Biden won in a landslide and captured the Senate with him, that the Democrats variously would legalize 10 million, 15 million illegal folks and turn both Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. into states, thereby adding 4 additional senators, and pack the Supreme Court, all of which would thereby ensure a permanent Democratic Party-run nation for decades on end. They were afraid that all of that would render future elections moot. But here's the interesting thing. If elections can be won by post-election day mail-in voting, by counting votes for a week after the election is over, then those 3 aforementioned vehicles of control are unnecessary. Wild stuff. I find all of that historical Indeed. Now again, we had a record number of folks vote in this election. And at one level, the mail-in nature of the election can account for that. It was just easier to vote this time than actually having to go out the door and go to a polling station and vote. But the as likely energy was hatred for Donald Trump, right? I mean, again, the Dems did not take the Senate and they lost 8 seats in the House. So what we just witnessed was not a Democratic blue wave. Normally, when a candidate wins the presidency, he sweeps along same party candidates with him. Trump himself seems to have lost, but the Republicans did not. Why? Trump as a man is as a bombastic, lacking in nuance, constantly in your face, nasty tweets, lacking in grace, polarizing kind of person. He lost. So it's historic. We went from Barack Obama as president, and on his heels it looked like Hillary Clinton could not possibly lose, but she was so dreadful a candidate that Donald Trump, yep, he won a shocker. And now, Trump himself is so hated, loathed across the country, that he himself lost to the least capable politician imaginable. So that's pretty historic, for sure. And again, we know that because there was no previous big acclamation of Kamala Harris. It's not like she carried Biden to the finish line. I mean, she only garnered 3% during the Democratic primaries. During the presidential election, she hardly campaigned at all in person, and Joe himself hardly campaigned at all. Joe Biden? Really? He won as a back-end candidate. 74 million people voted for Joe Biden. That's amazing. In 2012, 66 million voted for Barack Obama. Wow. Ambivalent Joe Biden out-campaigned the Barack Obama. Joe ran a minimalist campaign and garnered 8 million more votes than wildly popular President Obama. Wow. That's amazing. Stunning. But actually, I find that brutally difficult to believe. Like I say, I smell a dead rat. This thing does not pass the smell test for me. But still, is half the country excited that Joe Biden was elected? Absolutely. Did he win because he's Joe Biden? Not at all. This was a vote against Trump. I believe Trump lost far more than Biden won. And you know what? If that's legit, if that's a legitimate count, I can live with it. Oh, and finally, my reflections on the election itself. Is your seatbelt fastened? You're right. You do not hear me calling for Christians to quiet down and compromise their values. I see so much of that on Facebook that my head is about to explode. They're agreeing with people who are saying to them, "Let's join hands now in unity, you fascist." Thank you, Tammy Bruce, for that one. Where were all those calls for unity over the last 4 years?
Well, now, some people are happy and some people are sad. Christians, you need to learn to put your values on hold for the sake of unity.
Why? Why am I, the you, not calling for a worldview compromise? Because there is a cultural shift, a pomo, godless tide that is sweeping the nation. Sheesh, nations go their own ways, right? It's biblically commonplace for entire nations to move against the ways of God and go their own ways. There is a cultural shift, a neo-Marxist tide that's sweeping the church, reshaping thousands of churches themselves. So, in my mind, there are things worth standing for. There are things worth saying, even if that makes us unpopular. There are truths worth repeating, even if society no longer believes in truth. So, celebrate? Celebrate with those who hate Christ? Nope. Celebrate with those who hate the gospel? Nuh-uh. Agree to join calls for unity with those who stand against the biological categories of male and female? Nope. Rejoice with those who want pedophilia to become mainstreamed? Not me. I'm not gonna do it. Hear me clearly. Hear me clearly. I'm not at all calling for violence. But no, I also won't sacrifice godly values. Not gonna do it. Well, there's some reflections on what this all means for the history of America. I want to think with you about history itself. All my life I've heard good folks, Christians even, say, history repeats itself. But when I became a thinker, began to read books that were outside the box, began to ask and answer questions, I began to question that bumper sticker, history repeats itself. Sheesh, if anything, this election shows that history, in fact, does not repeat itself. But please sit down, think carefully with me for a moment. Does history really repeat itself? Well, for starters, what is history? Is history alive? Is it a dynamic force? Use the force, Jerry. Is it a force that's active in our lives? As a force, is it controlling things? Maybe history is fate. Is history God? Is that right? As the neo-Marxists would have us believe, God is simply history? Or is history Mother Nature? Gravity? Maybe history feeds off the photons of the sun, or more philosophically, is history a quasi-personal reality? I mean, does it think? Does it push and prod and manipulate outcomes? Just what is history? Is it alive? Obviously, the answer to all those questions is no. And for you college freshmen, that's spelled N-O. History is not a thing. It has no ontological essence, no atomic structure. History is neither a person nor a force. History is an interpretation of events, of the flow of time, of the meaning and analysis of human actions and decisions. History is perspective. It's understanding. And the truth is, interpretation, perspective, analysis, and meaning all require consciousness. So, usually, history is a shared consciousness. Now, honestly, I don't remember which philosopher, Nietzsche, William James, or which theologian, Pannenberg, Blush, Oden, I don't know who I learned this from, but history does not repeat itself. It cannot. It's not a thing. It's not a force. In no way is it a something with ontological reality. Ontology has to do with being. So it is much more accurate to say human nature repeats itself than it is to say history repeats itself. When people say history repeats itself, they are really saying, hey, there are discernible patterns at work in reality. Me, I believe the patterns they are observing are really the patterns effected by human nature. If you put human nature inside established situations and environments, you will see similar patterns and often similar results, right? For example, human nature is finite, so obviously the patterns we observe will involve change and finitude, the limitations of physical nature. Or human nature is fallen, so consistently we will see people choose self-interest, outcomes over righteousness, power over katatos. Human nature is adaptive, so consistently we will observe people, individuals or collectives, find ways to adapt and survive even in grotesque environments. Or human nature is irreducibly male and female. So we will always find patterns at work that, at super nuanced levels, involve our sexuality. Now, we could further build out that list of qualities about human nature that are discernible and which constantly show up inside the rhythms of life. But it's human nature that repeats itself, not so much that history repeats itself. I'm not a fatalist, but I do believe human nature repeats itself almost all the time. Except except when, because of our self interest or contingencies or contexts, it doesn't. And all of that makes life profoundly complex. And that, my thinker listener, takes me to my next point. But first, are you happy to have a voice, a place where you can get beyond the emotional vomit that is life in the 21st century Western society? Really? You are? Oh, I could just hug you. How can you encourage me to keep producing the UU podcast? That's easy. Tell a friend. Tell your pastor. Tell a thinker. Or please, oh please, oh please, say a prayer for the show. Pray for team building, for key relationships, for God's timing, for God's voice and purpose. And then, of course, you can go to Patreon, Patreon, and make a monthly pledge. We have established platforms of $5, $10, and $20, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, already set up for your pledging pleasure. But honestly, pledges of even $2 or $3 a month are appreciated too. $10 and $20 pledges get you monthly premium episodes. I have 57 of those to date. What about fourth in today's sweep of the show? What about God and history? You guys, after every election in my life, I've heard this one. Well, we prayed about it and asked God to have his will and have his way, and then we voted, so now God's will has been done. It's a bumper sticker. Ugh. Across my life, I've listened to that sentiment about local church votes for the pastor or for college presidential appointments or for national presidential elections. Well, we prayed like we were supposed to, so obviously God's will has now been done. Seriously? Is it that simple? Is anything in your life that simple? But you think it's that simple regarding the history of an entire nation? Or B, is God himself some kind of puppet to our prayers? Or C, are the massive outcomes of history as simple as we prayed, so God therefore did? Don't you think it's possible that Christians, prior to the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, were praying for God's will for Russia, for Europe? Do you really think genocidal Joseph Stalin was God's holy will? Do you really think the Holocaust was God's will? Yeesh. In 2 Chronicles 33, ancient King Manasseh participated in child sacrifice, built altars to pagan gods inside the Jerusalem temple, and caused the nation itself to do great evil. All of that was God's will? Really? Wow. The genocide of 10 millions of Chinese under tyrant Mao was God's will? Do you really believe that God wills evil? Do you believe honestly that God relishes the destruction of human beings? Man, I can't go there with you. Because the Bible does not go there. The Bible does not do that. The Bible does not equate every item in history to God's will. Please, you guys, there's something also at work in a biblical worldview, and it's called human agency. Class, say human agency. Human agency, teacher. The Bible tells us a story wherein human agency, both personal and collective, is active from beginning to end. Genesis to Revelation. Look, I know people mean well when they say, well, at least God is still in control. And yes, God is still in control, but that does not mean he is puppeteering everything. Think of it this way. A mayor is in control of the direction of a city, but the mayor is not puppeteering everything that all of that city's citizens do. A president is sort of in control of the direction of the nation, but the president is hardly dictating every little daily decision of the people in the country. God is still God, yes. He's still sitting on his throne. But God is not puppeteering every single decision that people make, even if they pray about it, even if the church prays collectively together about it. How do we know when something is God's will? Well, here are the answers. When Jesus Christ is exalted, when righteousness results, when shalom is wrought, the gospel is preached, cheating is stopped, the poor are treated as real human beings, when people find healing, when diseases are ended, when justice is put to work, when the least able to protect themselves, babies, are deemed precious and irreplaceable, when people can freely practice their religion. All of that is to say, we rarely know what God's will is until after the fact. Sometimes not until long after the fact. Is God still God? Of course. Does that mean that everything that happens in life is a one-for-one with God's will? Stop it. Hardly. That God is sovereign means he is Lord over history, not in every detail of history. Now, nothing can thwart the ultimate plan of God. Nothing will stop Christ's second coming. Nothing can change the fact that it is the gospel alone that is the power of salvation. But along the way, millions, billions, trillions of decisions, both personal and collective, will be made and are made that violate God's will. Human agency. And decisions like that can include elections. Human agency. Am I therefore saying that Joe Biden is not God's will? Nope. Because mostly, I don't know. We will find out later. But please, holy shnikes, stop saying that every last thing that comes to pass is God's will. Don't say stupid things just to try to find some peace. You will ultimately make God out to be the author of evil. And probably, because we all suffer, you will find yourself not liking God. Why do I care so much on this point about saying, well, God's will was done and all of history is God's will and, well, we prayed about it, it's God's will? I'll tell you why I care so much. First, it trivializes massively important historical events. When Christians automatically say, this is God's will, they unwittingly can dismiss enormous suffering or enormous pain, enormous evil. I believe that 10 millions of people do not follow God today because of simplistic Christian theology. When Christians say, your suffering is the result of God's will, people dismiss Christianity. They say, God is that kind of monster? When Christians say, we don't know why God took your little girl with leukemia, but God knows best. You guys, sort of believers or non-believers, simply just then dismiss Christianity. But it's not really Christianity that they're dismissing. It's bumper sticker Christianity that they're dismissing. It's not the truth that they're dismissing. It's trivializing, gooey Christian sentiment that they are dismissing. We trivialize things when we blame everything on God's will. Another reason why I don't like it when church folks say, "Oh, well, God's will has been accomplished," is because it dismisses the importance of decisions and actions. The truth is, what we say and do can be of profound consequence. The president whom a nation elects is a profound consequence. Willy-nilly interpreting things as God's exact will being accomplished trivializes the importance of decisions and actions. I mean, believers used to laugh when they'd hear other Christians say, "The devil made me do it." But when we read every event in history as God's exact will, we're being just as simplistic. And I've seen so many facile Facebook posts that say, "Oh well, no matter what, God's will has been done." You don't know that. And saying that just trivializes decisions and consequences. The Bible does not do that. The Bible shows that people's actions have profoundly awful or profoundly beneficial consequences. Lordy, God created a hell to deal with some of those actions. So, yes, God's will finally will be accomplished. Nothing will stop it. Not Lucifer, not even death. But we won't know exactly what God's will across the planet is or was until later. Or regarding the whole of history, we won't know what God's exact will was until the very end, when Christ returns. St. Paul himself said, "Now we see through a glass darkly, then we shall see face to face." And he's talking then about the resurrection, the coming of Christ. When Jesus comes and makes earth his new throne, then we shall share his perfect perspective on reality, on history. So please, would you be willing to exercise some discretion, some wisdom, some temperance, and stop telling everybody that everything that happens is a one-for-one with God's will? It's silly. Worse, it is horrifically bad theology. And if neither silly or horrifically bad theology convince you, then please know that equating everything with God's will is not at all biblical. You may actually be keeping people away from the faith by blaming everything on God. But then, in my experience, bumper stickers almost always prevent genuine faith. So there are some reflections on history. We are living in historic times. One thing is for sure, right? It's not boring. The amazing thing is, God called us just for such a time as this. Thank you so much, my friend. Thank you for listening. Thanks even more for being willing to think and address some out-of-the-box questions. I'm delighted to have had you with me today. Now, please, and go and turn your beautiful God-given brains on, everybody.